Okay, do we have the, I need to know who's presenting for the tiger sharks, the sassy sea urchins, snazzy sea urchins, and the fun guys. Go ahead and unmute, please.
I'm sharing for the fun guys.
Okay, Carol.
Oh, sorry. Yes, Caroline.
Caroline, you're present. All right, so I'm going to make you a co-host. And Savannah, are you presenting?
Yeah, I'm sharing for Tiger Sharks.
You're sharing for Tiger Sharks. All right, you are a co-host.
And then I'm sharing for the sea urchin.
Very good. All right, so we should all be ready to go. And let me just briefly share my screen. I did update the syllabus in terms of the due dates. So let me share my screen and everybody will see that. So this is the announcement I just sent around. Team presentations we're doing this week. Questions for each team, as people have done all along, are due after each presentation. And then the final report and the PowerPoints are due on the 18th of April, so that's this coming Sunday. The take-home final will be available at midnight or maybe earlier. I'll have to see how soon I get it out there, on the Thursday the 15th, and that's due the following Tuesday the 20th. And then on the 22nd will be the final exam, which will be given as we did the previous exam online. Okay, and I'm not using Honor Lock, but I am requiring you to be on your honor to not use external aids, and hopefully there'll be enough questions so that there really isn't time to use external aids and so forth. This is a measure of what you've been able to learn and how well you've been able to process that, and also how well you've been able to absorb the information coming from the different teams. Okay, so let me get a timer going here, and we will get started with the tiger sharks, and then we'll have the snazzy urchins and the fun guys. Let's see, what am I doing? So stop sharing. Okay, so I guess tiger sharks are up first, so please go ahead and share your screen, and we'll get started. Waiting for tiger sharks, and you should all have your cameras on. Then you need to share your screen.
Sorry about that. Give me 1 second.
That's okay.
All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, but you probably need to go into presenter mode. There you go. Perfect.
All right. So we are going to be presenting on the effect of ocean acidification on marine plankton.
With the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere climbing to their highest levels in recorded human history, it has become increasingly imperative to discuss phytoplankton. These microscopic organisms form the foundation of the aquatic food web. However, the large carbon dioxide influx in the atmosphere transfers to the ocean, leading to ocean acidification. This increasing acidity is harmful to the plankton and phytoplankton, with potentially devastating consequences coming to the economic and societal portions of our world. Next.
Phytoplankton can come in many different forms. They can be bacteria, protists, or even single-celled plants. Two of the most common forms are diatoms and dinoflagellates, seen in the figures here. The diatom moves through oceans currents to get through open water, whereas the dinoflagellate has flagellas to move it through the ocean. They're most often found in the photozone, and this is because they use sunlight to transfer into energy through photosynthesis, and they create about 50% of the food by photosynthesis and on the planet. This world map figure shows the concentration of surface level chlorophyll. This is used to identify large concentrations of phytoplankton. They're often concentrated along coastal regions where upwelling occurs and where runoff occurs. Chlorophyll is used to identify these areas because they often have blooms in late spring and early summer, which cause a higher concentration of this chlorophyll, which we can see on this map where the areas are dark green and yellow. However, sometimes these blooms go out of control and they create something called a red tide, which I'm sure many of us have seen at the beaches here and there. And sometimes the US has to spend up to $80 million a year to clean up these red tides because they can become toxic to humans and animals. The importance of these marine phytoplankton on the ocean come in two forms, in the food cycle and the carbon cycle. They are considered to be primary producers of the ocean, and they are the foundation of almost every food web in the ocean. So they can provide a food source for a variety of animals, anywhere from a whale to a zooplankton. And as we can see in this figure below, it kind of shows the process of how they absorb the sunlight to create food, which is then absorbed by the zooplankton who consume them, and then smaller fish can consume them, larger fish, and then maybe even a bigger predator who can then be caught by fishermen or just consumed by humans, and we can either get economic or even just a food gain from that. They also are very important in the carbon cycle as they consume carbon dioxide through the atmosphere and move it through to the deep ocean. They are the main proponent of this cycle, and losing them would create a great hole in that transfer of energy from the surface to the deep ocean.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the basics of ocean chemistry to aid in our understanding of how ocean acidification occurs. So first off, the ocean is in a chemical equilibrium with various dissolved salts and gases. In the context of carbon dioxide, which accounts for about 15% of the dissolved gases in the ocean, a particular set of equilibrium expressions can be used to outline carbon dioxide's presence in the ocean. Carbon dioxide has the capability of reacting with water, which allows it to be present in the ocean in many forms. As shown in the first equation, carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid. This carbonic acid can dissociate into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion, and then dissociate even further to produce another hydrogen ion and a carbonate ion. These equilibrium expressions are essential for ocean's reactions, essential for the ocean's response to changes in acidity. So for instance, if seawater becomes too acidic or the hydrogen ion concentration increases too much, bicarbonate ions combine with the extra hydrogen ions to form more carbonic acid, which decreases the acidity of the ocean due to a decrease in the hydrogen ion concentration. So when looking at ocean acidification, these equilibrium expressions can be used as scientific principles to explain its occurrence. So ocean acidification is the process of the ocean becoming increasingly more acidic due to the changes in the carbon dioxide concentrations in the ocean. The ocean acts as a giant reservoir for excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So as carbon dioxide levels increase in the atmosphere, so does the amount of carbon dioxide dissolved in the ocean. Over the past 200 years, carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere from industrial and agricultural industries have increased the amount of carbon dioxide by about 100 million parts per million, and is expected to continue to increase. This creates issues for the ocean. As more carbon dioxide dissolves, the chemical equilibrium of the ocean becomes skewed. More carbon dioxide is capable of reacting with water to form carbonic acid. As carbonic acid concentration increases, the equilibrium expressions shift to accommodate for this change, resulting in an increase in hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion formation. So this increase in hydrogen ion concentration makes the ocean more acidic, which alters the ocean's normal, slightly alkaline nature. So when the chemical balance of the ocean and its acidity shifts, this has the potential to create a cascading effect for marine communities. And specifically for the rest of our presentation, we'll be examining the impact on marine plankton.
Now for the ocean acidification impact on marine phytoplankton in particular, it has a massive effect and wipes it out. So ocean acidification kills off the populations, and not only does it affect the size of the populations, but also the diversity, which is extremely damaging. So there are main 8 types of phytoplankton, and it eradicates some of them completely. They're unable to withstand its effects. However, the diversity aspect makes it very tricky because one type of phytoplankton does a huge amount of work in being a carbon reservoir. These are diatoms, which you can see in this image. These are able to trap more carbon, and they sink faster and are able to keep pretty large amounts of carbon at the bottom of the ocean for a millennia at a time. Obviously they're suffering the effects of ocean acidification and losing their ability to do so. And this type of phytoplankton in particular, and its failure is kind of what's rapidly accelerating the struggle. So the rapidly rising temperatures, as you can see here, and the lower pH levels are what strain it in particular, and it ends up being too much to adapt. So overall, it limits the ability of phytoplankton to take in carbon, which is a huge impact because that kind of creates a cycle and it continues to damage the environment and phytoplankton in a pretty dangerous loop. It also adjusts the migration flow of phytoplankton. And lastly, the element intake. A more particular example of this is you can see in the diatom image here on the left. They're pretty strong structures, and their cell walls are actually made up of silica. The rising acidity levels actually limit the ability for diatoms to use silica in order to build their cell walls. Without their cell walls, they're not able to trap this carbon like they were before, and this is pretty much the most direct impact that we see in marine phytoplankton that limits its ability to trap carbon and sink it. Next slide, please. As for the methods and materials used to discover this, the most effective study was performed by the German Federal Ministry of Science. It is extremely thorough and kind of gives us better insight as to what went on. So they were tracking the size and biomass of the phytoplankton. So they were pretty much tracking the size of the blooms and the effect that ocean acidity had on them in particular areas, and then the biomass of the phytoplankton themselves, okay? They did this through image-based system, and they tracked these, and as you can see, on the graphs in front of you, and they plotted out to show kind of the rates and the direct effect as ocean acidification had impacts on an area. The biomass dwindled, the size of the blooms died out very quickly, they shrunk down. So looking at these comparisons, which are extensive, this is only one of many graphs from this German Federal Ministry of Science experiment. We can see that the pH levels have the most drastic and direct impact on the size and distribution of phytoplankton. And so overall, the impact of ocean acidification on marine phytoplankton is it gets rid of their size, it shrinks them in biomass, it messes with their migration flow, it limits their element intake, and overall it limits their ability to take in carbon, which starts this vicious cycle over and over again. Next.
Now, as mentioned by Jesse, how the phytoplankton struggle to survive in harsher, more acidic conditions, as well as their iron uptake being limited by increased CO2 levels, we could expect the same detrimental results in Florida. This mass death of organisms directly affects the ecology of Florida due to their large presence, as seen by the figure from NASA on the side of your screen, displaying high concentrations of chlorophyll in the color yellow in the red circle off to the left. The Gulf of Mexico, as well as the Sargasso Sea borders, are both very rich in phytoplankton, with up to 10 milligrams of biogas per biomass per cubic meter, with an estimated 40 million per cups of water. It's this high concentration of photosynthetic organisms that allows such massive ecosystems to survive through their supply of biomass and energy. Applying global trends to local waters, a 25% decrease in biomass could be expected if carbon dioxide levels continue to increase as they have. This would ultimately result in lower energy available to higher trophic levels, impacting predators up the food chain. Next slide, please. While specific research on ocean acidification's effects on regional waters was scarce, the effects on other abundant species could help draw some parallels. Looking at the figure included on the slide, Florida is home to over 350 miles of coral reefs, which utilize calcium carbonate as their skeleton. Not only is their structure compromised, which is a completely separate process in itself that harms several other species, but as another photosynthetic species, their production cycles are suspected to be interrupted by shifts in pH levels, resulting in delayed or slowed oxygen production. This limits the amount of CO2 uptaken and absorbed by the waters. While it can't be concluded that similar results between plankton and corals will be seen with higher CO2 levels in Florida waters, it can be suspected that photosynthetic activity from phytoplankton will be affected by any further decrease in the ocean's pH. Next slide.
And with this decrease in the ocean's pH, the economy and society will begin to suffer. Although it is not fully understood what will happen towards the economy and society, the United States government has pledged an extra $10 million towards research. This is important because phytoplankton form the base of the aquatic food chain. The Florida impact will be tourism, with approximately $6 billion total dollars going towards tourism in the Florida Keys. Coral reef tourism makes up a large part of that. The way of life of Floridians will be drastically impacted. The United States impact, if you look at the graph on the right, will suffer greatly, with $199 billion in US commercial and recreational fishing sales. This is not just money that comes from fisheries. This is what people spend on rods, reels, boats, any sort of fishing supplies that you could imagine, piers. And the jobs in the United States will begin to suffer too. The worldwide impact is 250 million jobs annually come from fisheries, with between 85 to $268 billion coming just from fisheries. The way of life in the world will change too, with fisheries providing about 15% of the protein of every person. Next.
Okay, so overall, the oceans of Earth are coming face to face with an undesirable state that could have a harmful effect on everything that exists within the ecosystem. The exploration of this research connected the phytoplankton populations that live in the oceans to the acidification that are taking place in these domains. And as far as legislative action, the Natural Resource Defense Council have pushed for more funding for research and monitoring of the ocean acidification for the coastlines. And the US Congress have recently increased funding for research from $6 million to $10 million. However, scientists know that more money needs to be put into it to be more effective. And then these are our questions.
Okay, let me stop the timer. Are there questions from the audience? Mana, how about your classmates here? Ask a question or two. Okay, well, I have some questions. I think we need to correct a couple things that were said. So Julie, when you said that 50% of the food was produced by phytoplankton, did you mean 50% of the oxygen?
I definitely misspoke. I just meant From the food that's produced by photosynthesis, around 50% of that on Earth is produced by the phytoplankton.
Okay. Well, I'm not. Okay, well, but you could also say that 50% of the oxygen generated from photosynthesis globally comes from ocean primary productivity. And I think that's the important thing there. I guess another question for everybody is, well, do you guys remember the calcium carbonate depth, calcium carbonate compensation depth, the CCD? How does the CCD work? You remember? Could very well be on the exam.
Above or below a certain depth, there's amounts of like calcium carbonate deposition on the floor. So like above that depth, there will be sedimentation, but below that depth, it's more silicon based.
Right, and that's because below the calcium carbonate compensation depth, what happens? In the deep ocean, what happens to the concentration of CO2?
I believe there's a rapid dissolution, correct, as you go below the line, and then I think carbon just becomes less readily available for organisms to use and create their structures.
Right, exactly. So above the calcium carbonate compensation depth, things that are made out of calcium carbonate are preserved if they fall to the seafloor. But below that depth, the concentration of CO2 increases because of the colder water and the higher pressure. So if the concentration of CO2 increases, what would you expect would happen to the acidity, to the pH?
I guess we would expect an increase in the acidity.
An increase in acidity, a decrease.
Yeah, a decrease in the pH.
Yeah. Okay. And so that's very similar to what you're describing in the photic zone, that the CO2 from the atmosphere is increasing in concentration of CO2, and then the upper layers of the ocean are becoming more acidic, right? So that's going to lead to the dissolution of plankton that have calcium carbonate shells, right? And diatoms have silicate shells. So we would expect them to be less susceptible to ocean acidification than, for example, coccolithophores or that have calcium carbonate shells, right? And so the way that ocean acidification impacts organisms with calcium carbonate shells, or in the case of corals that have skeletons that are made out of calcium carbonate, is that the more acidic water dissolves the carbonate, and it also makes it harder for the carbonate to be precipitated, for them to form the shells. It takes more energy. So that was something that I think that you need to explain a little bit better in your report, okay? All right, I think you did a nice job in terms of the timing and the handoffs, but there were some errors there in terms of how you presented the information that I wanted to correct. And you have a chance to correct that in your report. And if you have questions about that, please check with me or with Carrie to make sure you've got the details correct. All right. Okay. Next up is going to be the snazzy urchins. So snazzy urchins, please share your screen and let's get started.
All right.
There you go.
Is everyone able to see my screen right now?
Yes, looks great for me.
Okay, great. All right, hi everyone. Today my group is going to be teaching you all about dead zones. Dead zones are another name for hypoxic systems, areas where the dissolved oxygen is too low for living things to successfully exist. This threshold is usually located at waters being less than 2 milligrams of O2 per liter, or about 30% oxygen saturation. The main reason why this oxygen dead zone occurs is because of excessive nutrient inputs into the system, which is called eutrophication. Dead zones occur along coastal areas, often due to runoff from rivers, bringing high nutrient water into the ocean. As depicted in this image, these nutrients enter the water and cause a phytoplankton bloom. But there is so much of this phytoplankton that the dead organic matter eventually sinks down to the bottom and decomposes. Here at the bottom, the dissolved oxygen is all used up in the process of breaking down this organic matter. The real issue is that these two layers of oxygenated water at the top and unoxygenated bottom water are not able to mix. As a result, motile organisms that can escape the hypoxia do, but organisms that cannot easily escape are stuck in this environment and will die off. This map shows a global distribution of hypoxic systems in 2011. We know that as of 2008, there were at least 400 dead zones worldwide, and they covered over 245,000 square kilometers. This number has been steadily increasing as well, even estimated at a 10-fold increase since 1950. The main nutrients that are cause for concern here are nitrogen and phosphorus. There are many sources of nutrients to oceans, and fertilizer runoff is a main cause. This runoff of fertilizer has the same effect on ocean phytoplankton as it is intended to have on crops. It stimulates growth. As I said earlier, the lack of mixing is an especially important cause of dead zones. According to recent research, this slowed mixing is estimated to account for 50% of deoxygenation in the upper 1,000 meters and about 98% in the deeper waters. Another issue that causes dead zones to be worse is climate change. Ocean warming decreases the solubility of oxygen in water, making it harder for hypoxic waters to take in oxygen from the atmosphere. Ocean warming also increases rates of respiration for microbes and multicellular organisms, which will then cause the oxygen to be depleted much faster.
Okay, I'm going to talk about how dead zones affects biodiversity of the ocean in general. So biodiversity refers to the variety of living organisms on Earth. This ranges from our genes to whole ecosystems, and biodiversity is the direct result of billions of years of evolution, natural processes, and in recent years, the impact of humans. On Earth, there's estimated to be as many as 100 million different species, and much of that biodiversity is contained in the ocean. While much of the biodiversity is contained in the ocean is also one of the areas experiencing the greatest loss of biodiversity on the planet. Over 60% of the world's marine ecosystems have been degraded in some way, and much of that is due to human activity. And in turn, dead zones are one of the contributors to the decline in marine biodiversity. You can go to the next slide. So as Sarah stated, that dead zones, they're caused by excess nutrient pollution from runoff or ocean stratification due to climate change. And these are areas of low oxygen. This lack of oxygen in these areas makes the environment uninhabitable for marine biodiversity. And some organisms are able to leave the areas while others are not. So eutrophication is one of the largest contributors of dead zones, and these create algal blooms as seen in this slide. When the excess nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen run off into coastal areas, it leads to an increase in the productivity of certain marine organisms. Organisms like phytoplankton, algae, and seaweeds grow at a much quicker rate. When they grow, it creates the algal blooms, and the algal blooms is where, underneath the algal blooms is where the dead zones will occur. The algal blooms do not allow light to penetrate the surface of the water, and they also prevent oxygen from being absorbed by the organisms below. And we all know that sunlight and oxygen are both necessary for all aquatic life. And so the lack of sunlight and oxygen caused by the algal blooms negatively impacts the biodiversity in this area. All forms are negatively impacted, but benthic or bottom dwelling organisms like sea stars, oysters, and other non-mobile species that can't move out of these areas are the most heavily affected, because while mobile organisms like fish and sharks, anything that can move out of the area, will be able to move out of the area of low oxygen, whereas benthic organisms cannot, and so they die in these areas. Can you go to the next slide? So this figure here shows the different levels of oxygen as it decreases, as well as the different species. So here we have nekton and the invertebrates. So these are the animals, the organisms that have the ability to move out of the area, and that's why they're seen as absent once the oxygen begins to decrease, while the other organisms are dead once the oxygen begins to decrease because they do not have the ability to move out of the area. Other animals that are affected or organisms that are affected in the ecosystem are marine mammals and shorebirds. This is because these animals rely on either the fish or the benthic organisms that live in these areas. And when the organisms either leave or die from the areas, the marine mammals and birds lose their source of foods, thus causing further damage to the whole ecosystem and biodiversity in these areas. All right, thank you.
Okay, now looking at specific dead zones, the first dead zone we're going to be talking about is the one in Chesapeake Bay. So this dead zone has been caused by runoff from farms and wastewater treatment plants. So these excess nutrients, as previously stated, have caused eutrophication and thus creating a dead zone. This dead zone has a negative impact on demersal and pelagic adult fish. Demersal fish are fish that live near the bottom layers of the water. But unfortunately, when the dead zone is created and then it creates a hypoxic environment, these fish are forced to move up to other layers of water. And with pelagic fish, they like to be in the cooler, deeper layers during the summer months, but when it's hypoxic, they can't stay there. So then they're also forced to move up to the surface layers of the water. The dead zone has also caused a decrease in bay anchovy, striped bass, and copepods. Striped bass. So avoidance behaviors, meaning these species that are usually found in these bottom of the water to move up, and with the naked goby, they usually have to guard their nests, but then they're forced to move up and leave their larvae to die in these hypoxic environments. Also, as previously stated, it also has a negative impact on benthic organisms, as these organisms are unable to move up to other layers of the water and then are dying. You can go to the next one. This is a picture of the Chesapeake Bay. So as you can see, the pink is the dead zone. You go to the next one. And here's another picture that's more recent of Chesapeake Bay. And as you can still see, it's still experiencing a lot of hypoxia. You can go to the next one. And this is just another example of a dead zone, which is in the Gulf of Mexico. And as you can see, it's fairly large. And the next one. Okay, and then the last dead zone we'll be talking about is the Black Sea dead zone. So this dead zone experienced excess of nutrients in the 1990s due to river runoff, and has also led to the decline of many fish species, including anchovies, larger marine animals, including tuna and copepods. But luckily, this dead zone has seen a reversal. So the GDF, UNDP, and World Bank all kind of partnered together projects to pollution reduction and also limiting the excessive nutrients that were being dumped into the water. And these projects helped reform national agricultural policies and improved industrial and wastewater treatment. Sorry, you can go to the next one.
All right. Dead zones negatively affect human society since they're able to affect the economy and food sources of many communities. Dead zones have caused the fishing industry to lose millions of pounds of seafood each year, causing a major loss of money that alters local economies. The International Journal of Water Resources Development states that the mass mortality of sea life due to hypoxia causes large losses in stock and causes people in the fishing industry to work longer and harder for less reward. In the graph shown, published within the Journal of Water Resources and Development's article, many factors related to hypoxia show how the fishing industry is impacted. For example, hypoxia is leaving more fish dead or deformed and in smaller groups. Since there are more problems locating and securing profitable fish, the fishing industry has taken a big hit that will be difficult to recover from. And if we go to the next slide. In the Gulf of Mexico, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimated that dead zones caused the U.S. seafood and tourism industry to lose around $82 million a year. Many people rely on the revenue made from the tourism and fishing industry to survive. A large sum of people rely on the fish caught to feed their families as well. With regeneration slowed and the number of fish dropping, many are facing a difficult time finding other sources of food. But incentivizing businesses contributing to the agricultural runoff in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, making their practices more environmentally friendly can be a possible solution to lessen the environmental damage and improve the economy. According to the Journal of Environmental Management, there are 5 key financial incentives that could help restore the parts of the Gulf of Mexico that have been affected by dead zones. Those 5 include crop insurance premium subsidies, transformation of the private service provider business model, expansion and targeting of 2019 U.S. Farm Bill funding, development of new state funds, and direction of post-disaster federal funds towards habitat restoration, particularly in floodplains. By incentivizing better agricultural practices, it gives a better chance for the Gulf of Mexico, as well as other dead zone locations, to slowly start to recover from the previous harm done in their communities and help to re-stimulate the tourism industry and local economies. You can go to the next slide. Yeah.
Hey everyone, so I'll be discussing the solutions to some dead zones. So because the primary cause of dead zones, at least in the case of one of the largest located in the Gulf of Mexico, which Sabrina showed a picture of, is because of soil runoff and largely nitrogen. An obvious remedy would be to go to the source, and that source is farms and livestock operations in the Midwest who pollute their soil with synthetic fertilizer and in turn pollute the Gulf of Mexico. A seemingly obvious solution to this problem is to resort to a natural fertilizer, one that isn't composed of things that are unnatural for our animals and our environment and our oceans, of course, as well as ensuring more stable soil beds in order to reduce runoff. Unfortunately, there is more behind the scene, climate change being a big indicator as to why runoff is more frequent and resulting in the heavy distribution of fertilizer from the Midwest. An effort against climate change is an effort against dead zones. Most accumulation of things that promote the growth of the dead zones from a lack of regulation and a lack of care for our ocean. Just like climate change, this is an active effort for everyone to stay aware of, our officials to stay aware of in order to create a future with hopefully much less harm to our home. And on this next slide here, I just have a graph depicting how much nitrogen load is carried over through fertilizer to the Gulf and where most of it is originated from. It looks like Illinois and Iowa are the biggest contributors, and they flow from the Mississippi and Atchafalaya rivers to the Gulf of Mexico, thus creating the dead zone there. Thank you.
Next, we're going to talk about some more solutions about dead zones. The largest anthropogenic dead zone located in the Gulf of Mexico doubled in size after the Great Mississippi River flood in 1993. And this flood mixed into
Did you cut out? We're not hearing your text anymore. Can you check to make sure you're not muted? Looks like we got a little glitch here. Can somebody else jump in and try to cover what's going on here? Or?
We can just go on to our next point and hopefully he'll be able to rejoin the call if that would work.
That's fine, Sarah. Keep going.
Okay.
But you're almost out of time, so just go ahead and show your last slides and wrap up, please.
Okay, I'll just kind of cover these for him because I don't think he's gonna have enough time to get back in.
Okay.
But basically, it looks like he's just going over here. Yeah, he just told us that his Wi-Fi went out. He's trying to rejoin. It looks like he's just discussing the ocean stratification and how that contributes to the dead zones, the issue that they can't mix, and that's what's increasing the problem. And then we've got our questions here.
Okay, all right, well, and so these questions will be posted, but let's, does anybody have any questions? This was an interesting, far-ranging presentation, and I wonder if there's any questions that folks have.
Yeah, I have a question. So y'all talked about the Black Sea dead zone being recovered, but why do you think we haven't seen the same in Chesapeake and the Gulf of Mexico?
I mean, I would say probably the fact that like the Chesapeake Bay is more like near like urban areas, like factories and farms and such, while the Black Sea is more of like an open area. So I feel like it's harder to like contain the nutrients because like, you know, there's like more urban areas and like they're dumping more nutrients in the bay. But also the Black Sea actually had also seen decrease in nutrient use in agricultural because when Central and Eastern Europe collapsed, like it all decreased. So that also kind of helped the reversal of the Dead Sea in the, or sorry, reversal of the dead zone in the Black Sea.
Okay, any other questions? I think we need to clarify a little bit there. So the Black Sea is a special case because the Black Sea is totally cut off. You know, it's not like connected to you know, the larger ocean the way the Gulf of Mexico is, or even the Mediterranean is. And as a consequence, the Black Sea is permanently hypoxic or anoxic below about 200 meters. And so there may be recovery in the coastal areas around the Dead Sea, but there's no oxygen in the lower part of the Dead Sea, which is and that has not changed. So you have to clarify whether you're talking about the coastal Black Sea or the deep ocean you know, the deeper portions of the Black Sea. And I think you must have been meaning that that shallow regions of the coastal area had seen some recovery. I just wanted to ask you a little thought question. So have you all been following what's happening at Piney Point, the Piney Point question in Tampa Bay? Yeah, what's happening?
Yeah, a little bit for sure.
I saw it. I don't really know a lot about it though.
Anyone on the team know about?
I do know a little bit about it.
Yeah.
What I do remember is that there was just this very vast, large body of toxic water, and whatever was keeping that water contained fell through, and so the water was just getting everywhere. And the only real solution was to allow the toxic water to flow into the Tampa Bay. And I know that it was polluting the Tampa Bay area, polluting many homes, and polluting many just ecosystems around there.
Okay, well, let's maybe this is something I should put on the final exam because it's kind of a real sort of a real world example of the kind of problems that you all are talking about in your presentation. So Tampa Bay is very shallow. Anybody from the Tampa area, you know, it's not very deep at all. And then the Piney Point situation, that was a reservoir that they built, and they built it on top of an old phosphate mine. So the water, the fluids in that reservoir were very rich in phosphates and nitrates. And then what happened is they didn't maintain the dam, you know, that kept that ponded water intact, and it began to fail. And they were afraid that there would be a catastrophic failure of that dam, which could have, you know, flooded people's houses and, you know, created a wall of water, which would have been very dangerous. And so they're pumping all of this water into the shallow Tampa Bay area and that this water that's coming out of the Piney Point Reservoir is rich in phosphates and and nitrates. So what do you think might happen?
We'll probably see a dead zone develop over there as well.
Good. And why would that be? It's a shallow bay. So if there's not a lot of mixing, if the calm times, and then you're going to get plankton blooms and potentially hypoxia in the bottom water. So we could set up a dead zone right there, almost artificially, by releasing this phosphate and nitrate rich effluent into the bay. But they didn't really have a choice, because if they hadn't done that, the whole dam might have failed catastrophically and destroyed all those houses. So that's a pretty big problem. Let's see. I think they got cut off. The last team member there who lost his internet connection was talking about the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. Can you just guys say just generally what's been happening with that historically? Is it increasing or decreasing?
I believe it's been increasing like a lot over the past few years for sure.
Yeah, and that that's because there's more runoff, and then that started with that big flood, but over time it's increased quite a bit, and so these are situations that create real hazards for marine ecosystems. Okay, well, you'll turn in a Word document, please, to make it easy for Carrie and me to post your multiple choice questions, and make sure you indicate to us in the document which the right answers are, so we can have a key and make sure that what you think is the right answer, we agree is also the right answer. And then we'll put that online for everybody to see. Okay. And the final presentation for today is going to be by the Fun Guys. So Fun Guys, share your screen. You're on. Hi, Caroline.
Hi. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to share my screen.
Having trouble?
Yeah.
Are you able to share? Do you see the what happens when you click share screen?
I think
there you go. All
there
right.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay.
All right, so we're doing the Exxon Valdez and Deep Horizon oil spill comparison for our presentation. So to start with Deepwater Horizon, this is Transocean owned and was leased to BP, and it is an oil drilling rig that exploded on April 20th of 2010, releasing gas and oil 66 kilometers off of the coast of Louisiana into the Gulf of Mexico. There were multiple issues that led to the explosion, including some issues with concrete and valve failures. But the main reason was a blowout preventer failure. This caused flammable gas to be released into the rig, and an explosion occurred, which is what released the oil into the water, and around 4 million barrels of oil poured into the Gulf of Mexico over 87 days. And then it was capped on July 15th of 2010. And it's just a picture of before and after the explosion. And it's just a photo showing the oil after when it was released into the Gulf. The ocean currents, winds, and wave action moved the oil towards the shoreline, specifically loop current and clockwise running loop current pushed the oil and along with other eddies within the Gulf. 4 coastlines were majorly affected, including Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. This was around 2,100 kilometers of shoreline. And this included beaches, marshes, wetlands, and estuary ecosystems. A deep water plume was also created, which is the green part on the graph right here on the southwest. And this was at around 1,000 meters within the water column. And then the colors on the graph is just showing the red is fires that were used to burn off some of the surface oil. And the purple is dispersants that was used in the water. And then on the outside of the oil around the coastlines is how the shore cleanup assessment technique was used to color code the amount of oil that was at each part of the shorelines. So the red is like the heaviest and green is the lighter parts of the oil.
All right, the Exxon Valdez. This was an oil spill that occurred just after midnight on March 24th, 1989. Unlike the Deepwater Horizon, this was a cargo vessel, an oil tanker, a very large oil tanker at 987 feet. In total, it was carrying 53.1 million gallons of North Slope crude oil. It struck Bligh Reef, which is at the mouth of Prince William Sound at 12:04 a.m. The collision with the reef compromised the hull, cutting a gash into it. It then began to leak oil and in total spilled 10.8 million gallons. As you can tell, having a total cargo of 53.1 million gallons, this could have been much, much worse, exponentially worse, should the vessel have completely broken up, which is not uncommon in Alaska when vessels ground. Originally, operator error was blamed. The captain was blamed. There was a lot of salacious reports that he was drunk and didn't know what he was doing. This was actually not the case. He was sleeping at the time of the accident. He did err in putting a non-qualified third mate at the helm of the vessel, but the most likely reasons for the cause of the crash were just negligence, corporate negligence, to be honest. There was a faulty and non-working radar on the ship that the company deemed was, I guess, not a priority to fix. In addition, there were radar reflectors placed along Bligh Reef, and that would have signaled different safety mechanisms within the ship and navigation systems that would have averted this disaster. To date, this is one of the largest spills, second only to the Deepwater Horizon. Next slide. After puncturing the hull, oil leaked from the vessel for around 3 to 4 days. Another contributing factor to the devastating effects of this spill was just the response was extremely slow to develop. This is due to the remoteness of the area and substandard plans for emergencies. Over the ensuing months, strong tidal activity and wind, in addition to a storm, which came through the area a few days later, contributed to over 1,300 miles of coastline being affected, with 200 miles being very heavily oiled. Some of the remediation efforts utilized were skimming of the oil off the surface. Some dispersants were used, although the dispersants weren't well placed, as they were dispersed from helicopter, and I guess with wind and just trying to get them down on the right areas of the water was difficult. They also used high pressure steam and hot water to try to clean some of the beaches to ameliorate the effects of the spill. Also, many of the areas were left to natural processes to kind of discern what worked best and what didn't. To date, the estimated total cost of the cleanup exceeds $7 billion. Again, like I just touched on, this served and still serves as a real-time experiment for the treatments of oil impacts. Even today, oil remains at more than half of the shorelines that are continually studied. And it is considered more detrimental to the environment than the Deepwater Horizon. Again, for many factors, many of the beaches, as you can see in the picture to the right, are covered in these rocks that are have been glacially eroded and polished, have multi-lobes and do not fit nicely together. Therefore, getting into all the crevices and trying to clean the oil out is exceedingly difficult. It's not like a sandy beach where you can go in and just take off the top 6 inches of sand.
All right, so here we're going to be comparing the 2 different types of coastlines, so the environment and the ecosystems that ran along their coastline. So looking here is the Gulf of Mexico, and you can see the top right picture is an estuary, and then we got some mangroves and the sandy beaches that we're all used to. Next slide, please. And the key features around here is by nature, the Gulf of Mexico has higher water temperatures as well as natural seepage within the Gulf, so which it allowed there to be a better natural response to the actual oil spills. Despite the natural response, the coast still were severely affected. Scientists believe like one of the best places to really see where the damage is coming is from the coastal salt, coastal salt marshes, where they've been doing tests and they've been taking plots of land where they can still test out how much oil is still in the soil in those areas. If you look on the right, I'm not going to read out all the different actual animals that were harmed, but if you look, it's mostly crustaceans and fish animals, as well as seabirds were deeply affected. So next slide, please. All right, so this is Prince William Sound. Not everyone's familiar with where it was, so I added the picture so everyone can get a better idea. As you can see, it is very different than the beaches we're used to here in Florida in the Gulf. It's a lot more rocky. There's a national forest that runs to the north and the west side, or north and the east side of the sound, that provide a very different ecosystem that the oil was interacting with. Next slide. So here you can see there's no actual natural seepages in the Prince William Sound, as well as the water temperature there is just naturally lower. So its response, there was no real natural response to deal with the oil spill. So ultimately, a lot more sea mammals, marine mammals were killed, as well as seabirds, as you can see on the right side. On the plant life, a lot of it, the plant life was just algae that was got killed, but also a lot of it was killed through the response, through the scraping. They killed off a lot of the rockweed, which was one of the main algae they were finding, were dying off.
I will be talking about the attempts to clean up the oil. In the Exxon spill, we saw a very small shoreline response, which was detrimental as it increased the time of the cleanup. Not only this, but it was very expensive. Some methods of the cleanup included cleanup workers skimmed oil from the water's surface. They also sprayed dispersants, chemicals in the water and on the shore. They tried washing oiled beaches with hot water and to rescue the trapped animal or the animals trapped in oil. And then in the Deepwater Horizon spill, we saw the local governments in the areas that were affected step up and try to go after the spill. The local ecosystems, including marshes and estuaries, suffered severely as they had a hard time being revived. This was also a very expensive cleanup, with over $40 billion in 4 years to complete a satisfactory cleanup. In the case of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, one of the cleanup methods used were that workers treated the oil with 1.4 million gallons of various chemical dispersants. Typically, large amounts are sprayed over the open ocean from a helicopter or airplane. So that was one of the methods that they used to try to fix it up.
All right, I'm going to go over a little bit about the resulting legislation between these two spills. As to date, there has been no major congressional legislation passed in response to the Deepwater Horizon bill. There has been any number of proposed legislations that have passed through the House. However, I think most, if not all, ran into trouble within the Senate or at the executive level with the president and signing it into law. Some of these are the CLEAR Act, which is the Consolidated Land, Energy, and Aquatic Resources Act, and also the Spill Act, the Securing Protections for the Injured from Limitations on Liability Act. In light of no congressional legislation, the result was basically to rely on existing statutes and their amendments under the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, the Clean Water Act, and the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, the OCSLA. To continue on some of the resulting legislation, the Exxon Valdez bill, as we all, I think, saw in class, culminated with the passage of the Oil Protection Act of 1990. This did a number of things. It set new requirements for vessel construction and crew licensing and manning. All tanker vessels were mandated to now be double hulled. The Exxon Valdez, of course, was a single hulled vessel. And once this act went into effect, it was renamed and sold to the Mediterranean area of the world. And then once the European countries mandated double hulling of vessels, it was then sold over to the South Pacific. It also mandated contingency planning. It enhanced federal response capability, broadened enforcement authority, increased the penalties for spills, created new avenues of research and development. It increased potential liability to the corporations involved and significantly broadened financial responsibility requirements. Oh, I think you're muted.
Thank you. This is just our conclusion slide. Exxon Valdez is arguably the worst oil spill, not for amount of oil, because Deepwater Horizon was larger, but specifically when they tried to clean up or get rid of some of the oil, they ran into more issues, especially due to this being in 1989. There was less protocol as to what to do when there is a large oil spill. The remote region in Alaska made it more difficult to clean up the oil spill and provide the resources needed to clean the oil spill. This area of Alaska also has large tidal extremes and is prone to storms, which again increase the difficulty of response in the area. And then these are our questions.
Okay, any questions from the class for the fun guys for their fun presentation? Well, I'm going to ask you to defend your statement there that the Exxon Valdez spill was worse than the Deepwater Horizon spill, since you stated that it cost $7 billion to clean up the Deepwater Horizon, the Exxon Valdez spill, and it's actually more like $60 billion to clean up the Deepwater Horizon. So how do you defend that? One cost.
I think the defense was, our defense, I don't think was based on a monetary accounting of the disaster, although I agree that that is a parameter that should be involved. I think it was more of an environmental impact. And just in the absolute difficulty of cleanup and to get resources to that area and the delay that caused, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so that would also refer to the economic impacts because the
Oh, yes,
economic,
and the fisheries, and yes, I mean, it completely destroyed the herring fishery, lots of the salmon fisheries and whatnot.
okay, but I'm going to ask you to defend that one too, because the Deepwater Horizon had a huge impact, for example, in Florida, basically shut down the tourist industry for a whole, not a whole year, but the summer, and shut down the fisheries. And so there were, massive impacts there. So whereas the economic situation in Alaska is far smaller population.
Yes, there's got to be an accountant in our group, so they can take that one and crunch the numbers. Where's our actuary?
Well, I was just also going to point out that because it was in Alaska, there was like it received there are like less people living there, so that reduces like the economic effects, like how Florida has a lot of tourism. Like Alaska doesn't necessarily have that, but they do have very like unique and a very unique environment, especially with how far north they are, which Florida does as well. But I think it also received like less immediate attention due to its location. And so I think like economically it would hurt that region, but probably smaller because it was on a smaller scale, like people wise, because in like Florida and Louisiana, like all of them are very dependent and it's a very like large amount of people.
Okay, well, there was another team, and I'm not remembering who it was right off the top of my head. I could look it up, I guess. But there was another team who presented on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And I wonder if any of those team members are listening to hear, and what you thought about the impact like on marine mammals and birds. Is there any so we can have a little discussion here, because I think this is an interesting comparison there. So is there anybody from the earlier presentation on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill that wants to join in here?
Yes, Professor, I did present on the Deepwater Horizon, specifically the marine mammals. I think that Deepwater Horizon had a more notable impact, definitely. Not only with being more recent, but I think in magnitude, the amount of oil spilled and just the effect it had on Florida's ecosystem and the ecosystem of the Gulf was a little worse than Exxon Valdez.
Okay, all right. So we have an alternative point of view here.
All right, that's it. The gloves are off. No, I think I see your point. I think probably our statement should have been more specific. In other words, we should have directly identified what we perceived as environmental impacts, as opposed to just saying it's one's worse and one's than the other.
Okay, Tyler, so how would you, having heard this presentation and then, about the impact in the environment. So, I mean, comparing the environment of Alaska with the environment of Florida, not only is there a difference, of course, in latitude and everything else, but there's also a difference in terms of the amount of development and the sort of pristine nature of the two environments. So how would that, balance the impacts there? What do you think, Tyler?
I mean, they are two very unique ecosystems, and they're kind of at different ends of the spectrum. When I think of Florida, I think of more leisure and tourism, whereas Alaska, you're not going to swim in the water, you're going more to look at it. So the effect of oil on tourists is different up there, more so than here in Florida.
Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Also part of the team that worked on the Deepwater Horizon spill, and I would also like to add that I think that Florida's coastline has been more affected, or the coast through changing of the shoreline Mississippi River to allow ship access and stuff like that. So I think that was probably more damage to start out with than the Alaskan beaches.
Sorry, Catherine. I want to note that it didn't just impact Florida. Like most of the Gulf states were also hit by it, especially on their coastlines. Like Louisiana's estuaries were hit pretty hard, and so Alabama's coast. So kind of a bigger picture more so than just Alaska.
Well, it was a lot more oil. I mean, it was at least, you know, at least, well, let's see, it was like 200,000 gallons from the Deepwater Horizon versus about 10 million, 200 million gallons from the Exxon Valdez versus about 10 million from, so about 20 times more oil overall. So that's another factor in all this. But the reason for doing this is not to, you know, say that one side or another is wrong here. Although I think, you know, there could be some criticisms either way. But what I'm suggesting is that you're finalizing your report now. So this is an opportunity to go in and add some nuance to your discussion for both teams in terms of sort of trying to appreciate how the overall impact goes. Because a lot of times we come down to issues like this, particularly sort of trying to evaluate, you know, the legal and the regulatory impacts, and also the, you know, in terms of the, you know, how should we prepare ourselves and how should we understand blame. So that would be an opportunity for you to modify your final report a little bit to try to include some of these perspectives. Okay? Fun guys, and the other team too. All right, well, we've come to the end of our class. We have 3 more presentations to give. A lot of good questions are coming in. And so all these questions are going to be potentially on the final exam. I'm going to put a lot of these questions on because I want to encourage thinking around this, and you know, that you know, the student presentations are an important part of what we all learn from this course. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Yeah, I can't think of anything else for today. So we'll go ahead, and unless there's questions, if anybody has any questions about what's coming up, or you know, what's still due, or any of the due dates or anything like that, please. Oh, I know what the question was. There was a couple of students had asked me. They said, well, my grade is you know, based on 1,000 points, and we haven't quite gotten to 1,000 points. Well, that's right. We didn't have quite as many team exercises as I thought we did, because I wanted folks to concentrate on the milestones and the final report. But whatever the total number of points, I think it's about 950 will be the total number. Your grade will be your proportion of points earned to that possible total. Okay, so that's how your grades will be calculated. And if there's any questions about where you stand with your grading or anything, you can always email either Carrie or me, and we'll try to set you straight. All right. Okay, everybody. Well, that's all for today. Thanks very much. And I'll post this recording here. We'll go on the YouTube channels, and then the questions will be posted in the module for this week. All right, everybody. See you on Thursday.